In his memoir, the author Frederick Buechner describes how when he was at the very pinnacle of his career, he had just finished his Pulitzer Prize finalist novel, Godric. He had invites from Harvard and the White House. At the very pinnacle of his career, at the pinnacle of his power, influence, success, he suddenly realized how powerless he truly was when one of his daughters stopped eating. He describes it this way. There was nothing scary about it at first. It was just the sort of thing that any girl who thought she might be prettier if she lost a few pounds might do. Eat nothing for breakfast, maybe a carrot and Diet Coke for lunch. For supper, perhaps a little salad. But then, as the months went by, it did become scary. She got more and more thin till she began to have the skull-like face and fleshless arms and legs of a victim at a concentration camp. So he and his wife then they pleaded, bribed, cajoled, argued, threatened, did everything in their power to get her to eat. They so desperately wanted to help her. But everything they did seemed to make it worse, seemed to strengthen her resolve. The harder they chased after her, the more resolved she became. And this went on for 3 years. He writes, then finally, when she had to be hospitalized, a doctor called one morning to say that unless they started feeding her against her will, she would die. And he and his wife hear that, and they just wept. He describes how this whole season of his life was shrouded in darkness. For years of his life, he was stuck in a fog, consumed by fear, anxiety, anguish. Food lost its taste. Friendship lost its pleasure. He lost his ability to see beauty or meaning in life. And the psychologist during this time repeatedly told him over and over again, it's worth quoting here, the best thing you can do is stop trying to do anything. And he knew they were right. He knew that all of his effort to chase after her, to fix her, to change her, only made it worse. And he knew that he had to stop trying saving her, but that was the very thing he did not know how to do. And I read that, and I felt that. That powerlessness, that helplessness, that compulsive need to fix or save, that anguish and grief that goes along with that powerlessness, that inability to solve what must be solved. As a father, I feel that. I desperately want to save my kids, but I can't. I can't make choices for them. As a pastor, I feel that. I so desperately want to fix what's broken in you, fix your marriages, heal that, say it's okay, show you another way, and I can't. I can't heal what's broken in your heart. As a follower of Jesus, I feel that. I so desperately want it to be on earth as it is in heaven, but I don't have the strength or the knowledge or the influence. I don't have something. I'm missing something. The money maybe. I don't know. What is it? I'm missing it. I can't actually change this world and make it into heaven. And so saints down through the ages, they keep telling me something that sounds remarkably like the best thing you can do is stop trying to do anything. But I find that that's the one thing that is so very hard to do. So here's the question. When you're faced with your own powerlessness, what do you do? Well, what do you do when you realize that you have a compulsive need to fix something that you can't fix? What do you do when you realize I can't make this better? So we're in Genesis chapter 16 today, and when we pick up the story of Abram and Sarai, who would later become Abraham and Sarah, this is exactly where we find them. God has promised them a son, but now more than 10 years have passed, and they've been in the promised land, in the land of Canaan, and they're still sitting in this barrenness, in this fog, unable to see how it could possibly ever work out. They are alive, but to quote the author of Hebrews, they're as good as dead. It's like they can't experience life. They can no longer see beauty or experience pleasure. It's like they are as good as dead. They are powerless to fix it. And this is the part of the story where Sarai, the mother of faith, does what almost all of us do at some point. She decides that God needs help. She decides, I will take care of what God won't take care of. I'll fix this if God won't. Genesis chapter 16. Verse 1 reads like this. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So this is the first time we're going to meet Hagar in this story. We assume that Abram and Sarai picked her up somewhere when they were down in Egypt in chapter 12, which, if you remember, that's the story in which Abram basically told his wife to lie and go be with Pharaoh in order that he might protect himself and enrich himself. Yeah, that lovely story. You'd be forgiven if you don't know the name Hagar and don't know the story of Hagar. Because if you pay close attention to this very dialogue over the next chapter, you'll find that Abram and Sarai, they don't seem to know her name. In fact, they never mention her by name. Throughout this whole text, they will only refer to her as, literally in Hebrew, slave girl. My slave girl, that slave girl. She's nameless. She's an object. She's a possession, not a person. You don't know her by name. But the narrator, he knows her by name. And he seems to say it with a wink here. Because in Hebrew, Hagar is Hagar. Ha is it's the definite article, the, and gar is just the common word for immigrant or foreigner. It literally means the immigrant. As in Ruth the Moabitess, she was a Moabitess. She was an immigrant living among God's people. She was a gar. And so this is made even more dramatic when you realize that Sarai almost certainly means princess, and Abram means exalted father. So this is the story of princess, exalted father, and the immigrant. Now, if you were here at the beginning of the series, you'll recall that Abraham's story is not just any story. His story is, he is the father of faith. This is the journey of faith. This is the story of the family of God. So if you've heard the promises of God, if you're on a journey of faith, if you consider yourself part of the family of God, this isn't just Abraham's story. This is our story. It's yours. It's mine. This is the story of faith, which begs the question, what's the immigrant doing in the middle of my story? What's the immigrant have to do with my journey of faith, with the journey of faith? Now, I have a feeling that most of us don't think of the story of the immigrant very often. Most of us don't think it's very important in our lives or in the story of God, so this might be worth at least pausing on. Now, I'm going to hold back here and try not to over-explain this, but I'm tempted because it's so rich. But here, let's just see how this story about the immigrant, Hagar, connects with a few other stories, okay? So here's the story. There's this person who's emotionally overwhelmed, scared, running for their life into the wilderness, and then the angel of the Lord shows up and says, where are you going? Why are you here? That, of course, is the story of Elijah and the story of Hagar. Before it was the story of Elijah, it was the story of Hagar. In fact, Elijah's story is rooted in Hagar's story. So an angel shows up to a frightened young woman, gives her this greeting of God's favor, and it says, you will give birth to a son, and you shall name him Jesus, right? This is the story of Gabriel showing up to Mary, the Annunciation. We know this story, but this is also the story of Hagar. In fact, it was the story of Hagar before it was the story of Mary. So there's this servant who's suffering, a suffering servant. A servant who suffers at the hands of God's own people, but God sees, God hears, and this servant is going to reveal God's presence in suffering. Is that the story of Isaiah's suffering servant? Or is that the story of Jesus? Or is that the story of Hagar? On and on we could go. This story that you've likely never seriously studied or reflected on, is kind of the basis, the root of so many other stories in the scriptures. And whether you realize it or not, it's part of your story too. Which is curious. We ask the question, so why is this story of the immigrant so important to God? Why is this story so rooted in all the other stories? So she, Sarah, said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children, so go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. God seems incapable or unwilling to do what he said he would do, so I'm going to handle it for him. This is how this reads. How could this possibly go wrong, right? I'm going to do God's work. There's something lost in translation here, though, that is worth pausing on. So if you read this in the Hebrew, there's a word missing in our English text. It literally reads, so she, Sarai, said to Abram, look here, nah, in Hebrew. Look here is like, hey, you, look here, nah. The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. This just happens to be the exact same way that Abram spoke to Sarai when they were headed down to Egypt. He said to Sarai, hey, nah, look here. I know that you're beautiful, so when we go down to Egypt, I'm going to need you to lie and sleep with Pharaoh for me, okay? Do you see this? Abram, driven by fear, gives Sarai to Pharaoh like some kind of object to be traded in, possessed, cashed in on. And now Sarai, driven by fear, will do the exact same thing to slave girl. Do you see this? Do you see this cycle going on? Because hurt people hurt people. Wounded people wound people. Used people use people. And Abram, the father of faith, agreed to do what Sarai said. So drink this in. Sarah, the mother of faith, just told Abram, the father of faith, go sleep with another woman. He was like, okay. Now, if you're wondering, like, what are they thinking? That is a good question. So in the ancient Near East, let's back up a little bit. This was not unheard of, and this was not even considered immoral within their culture. There was a socially acceptable practice in which a wife could, if she couldn't produce a son, she would then have her servant or slave girl be a surrogate to bear a child on her behalf. That being said, in the history of the world, I'm not sure that we will find a single incident in which that worked out and it was okay. Ever. I'm a little ashamed to admit, but a few years ago, my wife and I watched a season of Sister Wives. Mm-hmm. Have you ever seen that? The Mormons who practice polygamy? If you want to know what this looks like, just watch that. It never works out. It makes for great entertainment and a terrible family. That's what Abram just agreed to. So let's be clear. The real problem here, let's not judge this from our perspective, even stepping into their perspective. The real problem here is not the social arrangement. The problem is that Sarai is done waiting on God and is going to take matters into her own hands. The problem is that Sarai is attempting to bring about the promises of God through her own means, through her own ingenuity, she's going to do God's work for him. The problem is that Sarai is so controlled by her own anxiety that she's intent on spreading it to everyone else. Everyone else is going to be caught in this anxiety with me. The problem is that Sarai seems to think that God needs her to fix the problem for him. And this is a problem that most of us can relate to. Too often, we can't imagine how God is possibly going to do what he promised, so we take matters into our own hands. God needs me to work nonstop around the clock. He needs me. If I don't do it, it won't get done. The work of God is dependent on me. God needs me to fix my family. I'm doing God's work for him. The Holy Spirit needs me to convict my friend of sin. He clearly can't do it without me. God needs me to make sure that my political candidate wins the election so that it can be in America as it is in heaven. He needs me. If my political candidate doesn't win, God's work won't get done. Jesus needs me to save my kids. Their salvation is in my hands. You hear this? We're like Simon Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane. The night before Jesus goes to the cross, Jesus is praying there, and then all the soldiers show up to arrest him. What does Simon Peter do? He pulls out a sword and cuts off the ear of Malchus, the servant. Why? Because Jesus needs me to save him. I'm going to save Jesus. And what does Jesus say to Simon Peter? Put away the sword. Put away the sword. I know you think you're saving me. You think you're helping me, but you're not. You're not achieving anything. And this, too often, is us. In the name of doing God's work for him, we just end up wounding everyone around us and achieving nothing. In the name of doing God's work for him, we end up wounding everyone around us. Now, I'm not saying that we should be passive. Abram is passive in this whole thing. Let's not follow his example, okay? We have an active role in following God. I'm just saying that when it comes to the work of God, the promises of God, sometimes maybe the best thing we can do is stop trying to do anything. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. So you can hear the contrast there, right? Sarai has been there for 10 years, at least 10 years, waiting on this promise of God and living in barrenness. But Hagar, it's instant. Instant. Boom, she's pregnant. It's almost like a mockery of her suffering, of her waiting. It's almost like an insult. When she knew she was pregnant, so this is Hagar, when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. So I do not claim to understand the nature of interpersonal conflict between women. I don't get it, guys. It's a mystery to me. But research suggests and experience confirms that generally speaking, women and men fight differently. They fight differently. So my favorite example of this is the MIT researcher Leonard Sachs. He did a study on school children, and Sachs found that boys on a playground are 20 times more likely to get into a fight than girls. 20 times! But then the research showed that if boys get into a fight, there is a good chance you will see them playing together later in the week or that same day. In fact, the researchers found that boys who get into a fight, it often resulted in them becoming better friends. Better. Girls, on the other hand, they fight much, much less often, and usually with words, not with fists. But when they get into a fight, it tends to destroy the relationship. In fact, the researchers found that little girls who got into a fight often wouldn't talk to each other for the rest of the year. So Hagar, she just poked the bear. She's about to get mauled. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You're responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave into your arms, and now she knows that she is pregnant. She despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." This language is strong. This is cursing language, guys. And this is the part of the story where we start to appreciate why the Apostle Paul holds them up as an example of how God justifies the ungodly. Right? This is the part of the story where we realize that Sarai has the emotional and spiritual maturity of like the Real Housewives of Palestine. That's what we're watching right here. And Abram, he seems to be no better. Watch his response. "Your slave girl is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." To quote the Old Testament scholar Victor Hamilton, Abram's judgment is at best lame and passive. Lame and passive. Men, you don't want to be called that. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Mistreated. This translation is helpful because you find this same word translated as mistreated throughout the scriptures, so you can find it. You find the connections there. But it's actually not that accurate for this specific meaning. Usually we would translate it oppressed, like physically, emotionally, psychologically oppressed. But in a domestic situation, we don't use the word oppressed or mistreated, do we? No, we have a word for this. We call it abused. We call it abused. Now, I want you to get the irony of all this. In Genesis chapter 15, just last week, God told Abram, Genesis 15:13, and I quote, "Your descendants, the Israelites, will be strangers in a country not their own, that they will be enslaved and mistreated there." Mistreated there. They'll be abused and enslaved. They will be slaves, abused slaves in Egypt. So he's talking about Egypt. Your descendants will be enslaved and abused by the Egyptians. And then if you fast forward to Exodus chapter 1, you find this very scene worked out. The Israelite women are having lots and lots of babies. And the Egyptians, out of fear and general like disgust and disdain, they act monstrously. They abuse them, enslave them, threaten to kill their babies. Now, do you see this? Long before the Egyptians enslave and abuse God's people are driven by fear and general disdain, and they act monstrously toward the Egyptians, towards the immigrant. Sarai abuses her, enslaves her, and threatens the life of her baby. That's the implication. Before the Egyptians ever abuse God's people abuse the Egyptians. Do you hear that? And so there is this simplistic pseudo version of Christianity that says there's good people and bad people, and God saves good people and judges bad people. But you will not find that in this book. Abram, Sarai, you and me, we are the bad people. We are. Like this same fear and disdain that drives the Egyptians to these monstrous acts of evil, it's in Sarai, the mother of faith, it's in Abram, the father of faith, and it's in you and it's in me. The difference is not that we are somehow incapable of monstrous evil, because we are capable, fully capable of terrible things. The difference is that by faith, the people of God enter into a relationship with the God who justifies the ungodly. And when you experience that grace and that love, the Holy Spirit pours his love out into your hearts, and it begins to transform you from the inside out. So that the ungodly, by the grace of God, miraculously, quite beyond our power, become the righteousness of God. And that's good news. God saves the ungodly. The love of God can change even me, even you, even Sarai and Abram. He's sworn to love us, Genesis chapter 15, so that no matter how terribly we get this wrong, no matter how unfaithful we are, he will be faithful to us. But what about the immigrant? God never swore to be faithful to her. She's not one of us. Does God really care about the immigrant? Verse 7. The angel of the Lord found Hagar, the immigrant, near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? So she's somewhere far south Israel in the utter wilderness, headed towards Egypt, presumably. Hagar, she's not running to find God. She's not running to search for God, but she's running from something, from abuse, but this is where God finds her. She's running away from the abusive family of God, the abusive people of God. Question: anyone here ever feel like you had to run away from God's people because they were so abusive? Don't raise your hands, please. Oh. It's an old story, but it's a familiar story, isn't it? God's people are abusive? What? So this is the first time we meet the angel of the Lord in the scriptures. And there's this nice rousing debate over who exactly is this angel or messenger. When he appears 58 times in the Old Testament, he speaks as though he is the Lord. And when people encounter him, they speak as though they encountered the Lord himself. So without getting lost in the full debate of this, it's probably safe to say what the scholar Victor Hamilton, he summarizes it this way. The angel of the Lord is a visible manifestation, either in human form or in fiery form, if you think of the burning bush, of the Lord. That is essentially indistinguishable from the Lord himself. So the angel of the Lord is a visible manifestation. So the important part here is that when Hagar experiences the angel of the Lord, she speaks to him as though she's talking to the Lord himself. And notice when he finds her, when the angel of the Lord finds her, he calls her, notice the first word he says, Hagar. He calls her by name. You see, Abram might not know her name, and Sarai might not know her name. But he knows her by name. And he has a question for her. Where are you coming from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. So she answers the first question, but not the second. She seems to know what she's running from, but she doesn't know what she's running to. Maybe she's not running to anything, just running from something. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. So we have to be so careful on how we read verse 9 here. This must not be turned into a proof text to tell abused women that they need to return to their abuser. It must not. if you want to know how God feels about the immigrant, Hagar, then we should read his commandments. Exodus 23. Do not oppress a foreigner, Hagar. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners because you were foreigners in Egypt. Don't do that to someone. Leviticus 19. When a foreigner, Hagar, resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. Don't do what Sarai did. The foreigner, Hagar, residing among you, must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourselves, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. You love them. Over and over and over again in the Old Testament, God commands his people not to do what Sarai did, but to love Hagar, love the foreigner, love the immigrant. So God is not sending Hagar back to Abram and Sarai because abuse is okay. It's not. But somehow, get this, somehow through her suffering, God is going to bless her. Somehow through her suffering, God is going to do something. In what is some most surprising way, God has chosen this immigrant to be a picture of, get this, the suffering servant of Jesus Christ. And notice how God's promise to her echoes God's promise to Abram. I will increase your descendants too numerous to count. She is blessed by God. The angel of the Lord said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son, and you shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery. Again, if you know the Christmas story, Gabriel informing Mary that she's going to give birth to Jesus, this language is shockingly familiar, that in some ways Mary is like a second Hagar. Like, whoa. But that's where the similarities kind of end. Because watch how the angel of the Lord will describe her son, Ishmael. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. So Jesus will be great, and he will be called Son of the Most High. Ishmael will be a wild donkey of a man. Literally, this is a reference to a now extinct animal called the Syrian wild ass. So this is a picture from the 1900s. They still existed up into the 1900s, and the picture in the early 1900s. We also have reliefs. So they are from the Assyrians, actually. This is Assyrians trying to grab hold of a Syrian wild ass. Now, our association with donkey tends to be stubborn, dumb, not the same association for ancient people. What they were so known for was being untamable. Untamable. So this relief shows the Assyrians going crazy, just trying to hold one down. Despite many, many people trying, these donkeys could not be domesticated. So Ishmael and his descendants, they would be like that. No one could enslave him. No one could turn him into a beast of burden. No matter how hard they tried, he cannot be domesticated. That's the point. So, if God came to you and said, you are going to have a son and he is going to be a wild donkey of a man, I doubt that you would take that as good news. But Hagar, who's never known freedom, Hagar, the slave girl, all she can hear is, my son's not going to be a slave like me. No one's going to domesticate him. No one's going to own him. He's not going to be mastered by anyone. People will know his name, and that is good news to her. So over the past month, a number of people have asked me what the Bible says about the war between Hamas and Israel, this right here. And people tend to expect me to immediately pull out my Bible and be like, let's talk about the bowls of wrath in Revelation, or let's go to Ezekiel 38 and talk about Gog and Magog, or let's talk about the 70 weeks of Daniel. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you're probably better off. Yeah. So if you want my take on it, though, if you want my take on this right here, it's this text right here. It's Genesis 16. So did you know that the prophet Muhammad believed that he was a descendant of Ishmael? Did you know that? Did you know that the Quran teaches that Ishmael is the promised son of Abraham as opposed to Isaac? In fact, according to their version, which was written 2,000 years after Genesis, it claims that Abram sacrifices Ishmael, not Isaac. And according to Islamic tradition, Abram and Hagar built or rebuilt, depending on the tradition, this right here, the Kaaba in Mecca, which is, it was built to commemorate going there on pilgrimage is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and you go there to commemorate Abraham sacrificing Ishmael and God saving Hagar. It's one of the pillars of Islam. Did you know that the sons of Ishmael are indeed too numerous to count? There's an estimated 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, in contrast to 16 million Jews. Only 7 million in Israel itself. So whether it's historically verified or not, Hamas views itself as direct descendants of Ishmael. And the Israelites are, of course, their brothers, descended from Abraham's other son, Isaac. So what does the Bible have to say about Hamas-Israel war? His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. He will live in hostility towards all of his brothers. So this is not to ignore or minimize the complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is not simply a Jewish-Muslim thing, and it is massively complicated by geopolitical realities over the last 100 years. And I also want to acknowledge that there are thousands of Palestinian Christians in the world. So it's not just a Jew-Muslim thing. There are thousands of Palestinian Christians, in fact, some in our church. Thank you, Louise. I love it. However, Gaza Strip is 99.8, I think maybe 99.9% Muslim, and it is governed by leaders bent on jihad, which is holy war. There's reason to believe that even if we could solve the deep geopolitical realities there would still be a deep, unseen spiritual root to the conflict. And the only person I know who can solve that is Jesus. Now, knowing what we know about the sons of Hagar, knowing what we know about the future, I want you to look at what happens next. She, Hagar, gave this name to the Lord, who spoke to her, "You are the God who sees me," for she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." So I want you to appreciate this. Hagar names God. The immigrant gives God a name. Hagar, the mother of the sons of Ishmael, gave the Lord a name. There aren't quite categories for what just happened here. You will not find another example of this in the whole of Scriptures. You will not. Throughout the Scriptures, sometimes God reveals his name to a man, Moses most famously. But here, a woman, a nameless slave girl, the immigrant, is given the privilege of doing what no one else in all of Scriptures are permitted to do. So the strong, the powerful, the rich, the brilliant, the godly, the hardworking, none of them are allowed to give God a name. None of them. But this destitute, abused, despised slave girl, God says, "You. I pick you. You can do what no one else, I'm going to permit no one else in the history of the world ever to do. You can name me." And she names him, "You're the God who sees me." Nobody else sees me. Nobody else is even looking for me. Nobody else seems to even know my name. But you're the God who sees me. So whatever you do with this text, let's not miss the obvious. Let's not hear the story about the God who sees the immigrant and then walk out of this room and be blind to the immigrants, the abused, those who are voiceless, unnamed, and unseen in our world. Let's not do that. In Matthew 25, Jesus famously teaches that if we want to see him in this world, we need to look for him in the least of these. In the hungry, the sick, the imprisoned, the naked, the abused, the nameless, the powerless, in the Hagars of this world. So get the implication. If I want to see the God who sees me, I need to learn to see him in Hagar, in the immigrant, in the nameless person, and the person who I naturally hate, who I'm threatened by, the person who makes me feel uncomfortable, the person who is not like me. That's where I'm going to see him. That is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roy, well of the living one who sees me. It's still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar is the original woman at the well. John chapter 4, Jesus finds a nameless, wounded, sinful woman at the well. She appears to be running from something. She's hiding from something, but Jesus finds her. Jesus goes there, he meets her, and then he sees her. He sees her in a way that probably no one else in the history of her life has ever seen her, and it changes her. There's a grace, there's a love, there's a presence of Jesus seeing her. That same God who came after Hagar at the well is the man Jesus who came after the woman at the well, is the man Jesus who came after you. He knows your name, even if no one else cares or knows. He knows your story. He hears your cry for help. He sees your suffering. He is the God who sees you. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. So when you're faced with your own powerlessness, what do? I love this story because I don't quite know what to do with it, because it bursts all of my categories, because it forces me to come to this place where God clearly thinks not like me, and that's where I meet the God who sees me. I want you to notice in this story, everyone's caught up in this mess. No one walks away clean. Sarai tries to do what God alone can do, and she becomes abusive. She wounds everybody in the process, and her story has been repeated and repeated. This is the story of the good Christian who, in the name of doing God's work for him, becomes angry, fearful, and abusive. And not entirely without reason. Remember, Hagar despised her, and immigrants, some of them really are criminals. And progressives some really are out to get your children. And some people in our world really do want to dismantle the Christian faith and ruin your family. They really do. So are you going to become angry and abusive like Sarah in the name of doing God's work? And Abram, he's more comfortable for most of us. He's just entirely passive and lame. He's so passive that he ends up participating in grotesque evil. And Hagar, she's truly a victim, right? She is a victim, but she's not an innocent victim. Now, I'm not blaming Hagar here. I'm really not. I'm just pointing out that hurt people, wounded people, wound people, use people. Everybody's caught up in this mess, and somehow, God's working in it all. Somehow this doesn't stop God's plan. This doesn't stop God's promise. Somehow, he is the God who justifies the ungodly. Isn't that good news? He will be faithful to Abraham and Sarah, even if they're faithless. And he will love Hagar, even if no one else will. Because he is the God who sees you. Father, I don't quite know what to do with this text except sit with my brokenness and our brokenness in front of you and ask you to heal it. God, right now, I want to confess all of the times that we have been tried to do your work for you and become abusive, all the times we've been passive, all the times we've run away from you. God, I pray that you would meet us, that you would catch us, that you would find us, you would see us and begin to transform us. We pray this in Jesus' name.